Okay, so welcome again to today's webinar, How to Provide Secure and Personal Transitions, Onboarding, Offboarding, and Everything in Between. My name is Kaylara McCormick. I'm on the video team here at Bamboo HR, and I will be your moderator today as well. Also, feel free to share where you're from in the chat. I know a lot of us are probably working remote, so I'd love to hear where you're joining us from. Wow, the Philippines. Okay. Toronto, LA, Vancouver, Ireland, Michigan, Pakistan, Israel, Mexico. Wow, we're all over. Texas, Washington, another Philippines, Nigeria, Houston. Awesome. This is great. I love how we're from all over. That's awesome. Okay, well, we have some great content for you today. Before we jump in, get to know our presenters a little bit more and go over the agenda. We do have some housekeeping items. So first off, if you did join at 10 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, we apologize for the time mix-up. Sometimes these things happen, so we appreciate your patience and understanding. But we're really happy that you're joining us today, and we really appreciate you taking time out of your day to attend. So feel free to submit questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A feature on the Zoom interface. And then we'll also have Q&A session at the end, time permitting, and we'll address as many questions as we can. And then secondly, we will be sending out a copy of the slide deck and the recording of today's webinar within 3 business days. So make sure you check your inbox for that. And also check your spam folder because sometimes the emails filter there. And then lastly, this webinar does qualify you for 1 hour of SHRM credit. So if you attend for at least 50 minutes, that's 50, of today's webinar, you'll automatically receive that certification in the next 3 business days as well. And our system does track your time automatically. So no need to feel like you need to track your own time. And that's it. So let's go ahead and jump in. First off, I do want to say thank you so much to JumpCloud. We're really excited to be partnering with you on today's webinar, How to Provide Secure and Personal Transitions, Onboarding, Offboarding, and Everything in Between. So today's agenda, how to navigate important workplace transitions, how to provide both security and personal connection in onboarding, strategies and tools to streamline employee access to needed software, and then we will discuss the underrated costs of ineffective offboarding and how to prevent them. So I'm excited to jump in. I'll have the panelists start by introducing themselves. So Chase, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, sure, real quick. So first, thank you so much for having me. My name is Chase. I'm a principal strategist here at JumpCloud and excited to see all the different locations that are represented globally. So thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. My name is Adriana Clark. I am the HR manager here at Bamboo HR. Super excited to participate in this very important topic. And hopefully we have some great takeaways once we complete the session. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. And the first thing that we want to talk about is compliance. Compliance has to come first. There are 3 factors that we need to consider when we're talking about compliance. We need to think about law, leadership, and employees. Human resources was created as a result to labor laws. And since then, compliance is the foremost topic for HR and what we face on a daily basis. It could be anything from compliance issues that were uncovered in an audit, an employee relations matter, or even any sort of data breach. It is our responsibility as HR professionals to be prepared to address these matters and to address them in a very appropriate and timely manner. So let's go ahead and continue and dive in a little bit more. How do we as HR prepare ourselves to assure that we are compliant and that we're protecting not only the organization, but our employees? There's a couple ways that we do this. We do this with building policies. Now, when we hear policies, well, not us in HR, because we're used to this, but when managers hear policies, they're like, no, this is a roadblock. I'm going to have red tape. But we need to help them understand that these are guidelines to assure consistency and fairness. These guidelines are there to protect everyone. And so again, it's not just protecting the organization, but it's also protecting the employee, the leadership. And it's very important to note that we all need to follow the standard labor laws, which we all know, right? And regulations, they're there for a place. We can't deviate from that. But what are we doing internally to make sure that the company leaders and employees are aligned when it comes to these things? And another important point is that HR needs to be seen as a true business partner. It is more than just managing the employee's life cycle, right? There's a whole nother part to it. As HR, we oversee the most important part of a successful business. And we do this by assisting in the productive and thriving workforce, in building good relationships with leaders and helping them understand compliance, right? So we're coming from a place of not telling them what they can or cannot do, right? We, again, don't want to be that roadblock. We don't want that red tape, but really helping them understand the whys behind it and how it benefits all of us, right? And again, it's just there to protect everybody. And at the end, what our end result is to make sure that everyone has a better overall experience. So with that, many of the missed compliance requirements happen during transitions, okay? So what are some transitions that that maybe we look at and we can identify some misses? This could be during a promotion. It could be during a role change or a restructure. We want to ensure that all of our data is secure, right? Especially during those transition times. Is the appropriate access granted to each employee? How are employees storing company data, right? Are they storing it appropriately? Do they know how to store it? Or are they just saving it on their personal computer, right? That's where we start running into a lot of problems and issues. So the next point we want to discuss is onboarding. So it really boils down to the employee experience, and that really starts on day one. Honestly, it even starts before then, when the employee goes through the interview process, when they get that offer letter, right? But making sure that their day one is planned out for them is very critical. It's a very important part of that life cycle. The reason it's important is because it sets the tone, right? It affects the employee's retention. It affects their experience. And it also affects the employee's time to contribute, right? So the quicker we bring somebody on, the quicker we can get them up to speed, they're contributing, right? That also helps them to feel much more valued, right? That they're being able to be a part of something. So making sure that employees have everything that they need to be successful. So what are some of the things that we need to consider? Big one is equipment, right? Especially now as being remote. How are we handling those transitions and making sure that the employee has what they need on that first day? Do they know where to go? As funny as that sounds, I mean, I've had experiences where I'm like, okay, I mean, I guess I'm going to start at 8 and I just come in. I don't know, right? Because nobody took the time, right? So again, it goes back to that employee experience. Connect them with the team and managers, right? Help them start building those relationships, right? Outlining what the employee should expect on day one, the first week. Is there a 30, 60, 90-day plan? We want to be able to showcase to the employee that, hey, we care, we're excited that you're here, we want you here. Here's what we have outlined for you. It gives them the opportunity to be much more engaged and proactive and know what to expect. So again, when the employee is aware what to expect, the results are, again, a better employee experience, which then again leads to better retention, right, in the long run, because again, the employee is much more invested and making sure that they're feeling welcome. So again, it's a very important part of their journey, and it really solidifies that they made the right decision by joining our organization. So I'll hand it over to Chase.
All right, perfect. Well, 82%. Holy cats, Batman, that is a big number. And so I think just to go to the point Adriana made, it has such a big impact in terms of how you're thinking about joining the organization. What does that look like? So if you're able to create a great onboarding experience, it kind of sets up all of those expectations for what could be ahead, right? Like, okay, this is great. And it's also when it starts to go awry a little bit and you have some friction points or it's not as smooth as you might think, that's also kind of, it starts to put the mindset or kind of precede that, like, well, what other things are hard about this organization, right? If I can't even get through the front door easily, what are the other things that I should be looking for? So it just goes to show that having that great onboarding experience kind of helps bring people, makes them feel part of the tribe, makes them feel included, and it really kind of sets them up for much greater success in terms of the organization as they progress through that. And what's interesting too is I think a lot of us are joining in terms of digital squares, if you will, right? In terms of how we're joining those new organizations. And when we're doing that, something interesting happens where really employees kind of expect this seamless level of access, because in this notion, we're kind of almost using access as a proxy for trust, right? So you might not have as much physicality or kind of meeting people kind of ad hoc as much as you used to. And this is really important for people coming in, because then you say, well, you know, hey, if I can't get access to anything, why don't you trust me? Didn't you, like, why can I get into the things that I feel that I need to do my role the best to my abilities? And so it's really interesting kind of understand this component and how important it is kind of as a bedrock to create those great onboarding experiences for employees as they come into the organization, as you're thinking about, you know, levels of access, but then also how they feel about it in terms of levels of trust that they should feel entitled to kind of as they join the organization. So how do we do this? And so how do we take, you know, our human selves and then essentially transform us into our digital identities, right? Making sure that we now provide those digital identities all the superhuman powers that they need to access resources across the globe, whatever else that might be, to kind of get their role done. And so we're going to be looking at this kind of from a couple different angles. First is we're going to dive in a little bit more into kind of, let's say, the piping of the architecture, kind of those big rocks that you want to think about to create that great employee onboarding experience. And then we're going to take a look at what that looks like from the employees themselves, right? And kind of bringing all those elements in together. So we'll hop in and look at that. So for us, how do we do this, right? How do we assign provision, identity, and access, you know, for those who might be a little bit closer to the IT side of the arm, right? Making sure that we can do that. And so for us, we start to think about, well, where does that person start? Where does the origin of that identity begin? It could begin applicant tracking systems, could be put in Bamboo right away. You also have a couple of these resources that I threw out there. One of the biggest, I'd say, most important parts to starting this whole piece is making sure that you can get everything into one pane of glass, right? Kind of one level of viewing all of those different identities. For us, we're blessed, right? We want to live within a cloud directory because that's the best way to manage and think about access across all of these different things. But what happens, because that's really important, is it also kind of prevents this user schizophrenia, right? So as Mary Adams joins on, we don't want Mary Adams 1, 2, and 3 and kind of all different roles and resources. We want to make sure that all of that is brought into one point of view, because then now we feel empowered to kind of layer on additional access points or kind of provision that person, right? Now that we've taken their digital human selves into all the other areas that we need to get their role done. So the next piece that we're going to move into will be on devices. And I bring up device choice pretty specifically here because we want employees to kind of feel empowered to kind of work on what they need. So personally, like I've been working on a Mac most of my career, right? And so if I switch and kind of join a new organization that's a Windows only shop, like, it's a little bit of a jarring experience, right? It's something to think about in terms of how you're onboarding. So we want to make sure that employees feel empowered to kind of get the work done, regardless of what that looks like for them. And I bring this up more specific because we're, especially, too, in terms, I'm sure you heard the Great Resignation, but at least there's a lot more folks that are transitioning through organizations at a faster clip than they used to. So making sure that we're getting provision, kind of getting set up and marrying those two images. So now we have essentially identities coming in, but now we're able to get on a device so we can start to feel like we're getting work done. But there is the next level of this. We also kind of want to think about devices. They're the most crucial and most oftentimes now the only piece of equipment, right, that lives within organizations that are being shipped out to employees. So we want to make sure that we're securing those devices as well. So what does that look like? So a couple kind of tips and tricks, if you will, in terms of kind of getting this up and running. I'd say best practices when you're thinking about getting those pieces in motion, because again, it's a very critical piece of equipment, is one, we want to make sure that it's up to date, it's patched, right? An up-to-date machine is a very secure machine when we're thinking about it. And we also want to make sure that those drives are encrypted, right? So even though we're having a lot more access points in terms of applications, we'll cover that here soon, there's still some raw input that's living on that machine. And so if we do leave it on an airplane or a bus or kind of anywhere else in between, we want to make sure that that data is protected for the organization. And then the last piece here, which is a little bit more interesting, people might not think about it quite as much, is you don't always need admin rights on the device that you're running on. And so this might surprise some people, but it also helps organizations make sure that you can just use the device for work instead of kind of allowing it being worked on, if you know what I mean. And so the next piece, now that we have identities set, we're kind of set up with our devices of choice, is now kind of access into everything else. So what does that look like? Well, now we want to make sure that you're able to get onto the networks, right? So especially this is important for folks that are transitioning from home or back in the office, which is kind of true for me, right? Making sure that that's a seamless experience. But then also too, now that we've took the effort of combining that identity into truly one identity, we can start to provision and kind of give access into all those target applications. And this is really important, right? Because this is where we have crucial conversations. This is where we have proprietary processes. This is where our code lives. For a lot of organizations, a majority of their intellectual property lives outside of the organization, right? So it becomes even more crucial as you're starting to think about, okay, as they're joining, like, what should they be able to have access? Why is this important? And making sure that along that way, we're still making sure that that marries up to trust, right? Because we're using that as a proxy. And then everything else that they might need in between. And you can start to think about adding in all of those layers. And so real quickly, kind of walk through, like, I'd say 3 big rocks, if you will, kind of transforming into an identity, making sure that it lives on the device. Then you're able to access all the other things that you need to have. So what does this look like from the employee's perspective, right? So you can imagine, hey, I put in my 2 weeks, I'm going to be joining a great new organization. Maybe a day before, right, a box shows up and you unpack it, and your brand new device, and then you log in. And that's it. Now, what a great onboarding experience you just created, right? Because we know on the back end, we put together all that effort of kind of, okay, the identity is going there, we will provision access on device of their choice. And so the IT and security teams and people and HR teams are all kind of working together, and we kind of understand that. But from the employee's perspective, essentially what you delivered is a true out-of-the-box experience, right? And they know that they're able to kind of hit the ground running and they have access to everything that they need day one. So you're removing a lot of those friction points, right? And making sure that even though it's kind of pseudo access, they feel much more empowered, they feel a lot more trust within the organization and can say, okay, oh, wow, okay, I'm going to hit the ground running. And so I'm actually going to transition that over to Adriana and kind of explain a little bit more what that impact looks like.
Thank you. So once again, if we do things right, the employee is able to start contributing on day one. They are engaged. They have everything that they need to do their job and be successful. So as Chase was saying, nothing better on day one. You know what to expect. You know where you're going. You have what you need. You turn on your computer and everything's working. I mean, that's just amazing, right? When we have a delay in that process, what happens is the employee is not as engaged, right? Naturally, retention decreases. The employee isn't as invested. And why is that? Because it shows that the organization is not as invested in the employee. and we haven't committed to setting them up to be successful, right? So again, making sure that they have everything on that day one is just very critical. So how do we stay connected and engaged during change? Any kind of change is always hard, right? Good, bad, and different. This is why it's very important that employees feel supported during this time. So they're understanding the why behind the change and what's happening. Again, to reemphasize, day one is super critical. We want to make sure that employees are feeling welcome. Help them feel like they're already a part of a team. And you can do that by anticipating their needs. As I mentioned earlier, we want to be ready with day one, week one, a 30, 60, 90-day outline and roadmap of what they should expect. Set those expectations from the very beginning so there's no surprises. They know where they're going, what needs to happen, right? Our goal is to eliminate the obstacles that will have any delay in the process and any delay in allowing the employee to contribute. So what are some of the things that we can do to help in this process? I think one of the most critical pieces would be to share the big picture with the employee. Help them understand it. What does it mean? What is the goal of their organization? What is the goal of my role? How am I contributing to that bigger picture? Help them understand how their success and work is measured and help them set up goals, right? If they don't know how they're being measured, it kind of puts you in this limbo, right? And again, you're not setting those expectations correctly from the very beginning. Something else that we can do is take a look at our current processes. Are there certain processes that are taking away from the employee being able to be more efficient and effective, right? Review them. When you're doing something for a long time, this is just how we do it, right? This is what happens, but be open to look at, is there a way to streamline it? Is there a better way for us to be much more effective? And getting the access they need to get their job done. Do they have the right tools, such as software, programs? Do they have the appropriate access, right? That can be a real big pain point, and again, can delay a process. It can delay, the employee ramping up and getting started. So all things to consider and map out. Make sure that you have this outlined and it's very clear. So now I will hand this over back to Chase.
Yeah, well, and so I think gatekeepers, not my favorite, right? And I think they tend to say that, gatekeepers is essentially just a process living in person. That doesn't really scale. So one of the other best practices that I'd love to kind of share with everyone is kind of thinking about this a little bit differently. So like, let's get gatekeepers out of there. Let's look at this from kind of an access matrix for growth. And I think this is really helpful for organizations to think about, particularly for new employees, new roles coming in the organization, kind of understand pre-mapping a lot of like, okay, you should have access to this, you shouldn't have access to that. But it does a couple different things. It gets everyone on the same page, particularly from people to IT, security, and new employees themselves, to understand like, okay, out of the gate, here's what you should have access to and kind of set expectations. But then it's also important kind of as you think about going beyond onboarding, but all these kind of additional transitions that you have throughout the organization is kind of how you continue to maintain that and stay ahead of that access, right? So you might think about it and say, hey, I've been promoted from software engineer 1 to 2 to 3 to engineering manager. Or you might be thinking about, what are there different levels of access, right? And kind of different prod securities, other things that you want to have within that. But it could also be other departments, right? So it could be switching from product marketing into product management. It could be moving from a sales role into a marketing role, or I'd say some of those, complementary department jumps that you might see. Or who knows, you've been promoted chief of staff and you need access to everything. It's one of those areas where kind of having a plan for that helps enable a lot of those folks to understand what that looks like and get those gatekeepers out of the way. Mm-hmm. So now how do we bring this to a close, right? And kind of thinking about that last piece, or kind of protecting the organization when employees leave. I like to be optimistic and say everyone kind of won the lottery, because otherwise why would you leave? But it is a reality in terms of organizations and closing that gap, because it is one of the largest security gaps that a lot of people don't think about, because we all think that, we're well-intentioned human beings. So another big number, right? 63%. A majority of employees agree from taking data to one place to another. And again, I like to be optimistic. I'd like to think that not all of this is nefarious. We are living in the golden age of cybersecurity attacks, right? So the threat out there is very real. We're also living in the golden age of sourdough bread starters as well, right? So I kind of let's hope we'll be more optimistic on this side, and not everyone's doing it or kind of become bad actors as you think we're leaving organizations. But at the same time, when people leave organizations, they typically move into a very similar department, right? Or at least kind of within similar industry or market. So already there's some best practices and other things that are leaving the organization, which is an element of that, right? Because you hire people that are experienced, you want to bring that in. But there's also some elements like, oh yeah, here's something I did, or here's something else I did from that. And we'll see what we can pull through. I get some other files. But it's all of those pieces of information, kind of intellectual property, that's leaving the organization. And that's kind of how can we set up a better security posture to kind of make sure that that doesn't happen, or it happens a lot less. So one element is let's bring all those pieces together, right? Because we did such a good job of putting all of those big rocks together on the beginning when they join the organization, now it's just a matter of kind of turning those off all at the same time. This gets a little bit harder. So you might have heard the term kind of shadow IT. So it's hard to turn off things that you didn't know about in the first place, but the more that you can combine and consolidate into one platform, or kind of stack, if you will, in terms of how you're thinking about employee movement throughout your organization, a lot easier it is. And so now that we have all these pieces tied together, when we turn them off, move to the next slide, then you can kind of see all of those elements are now revoked all at the same time. And so this is really helpful for the organization, because then you can think about, great, I'm removing that identity, right? And I'm removing that from other applications it might be. I'm removing that person from the device, right? So the device is still secure. I'm removing them from the networks. They can also be somewhat of a jarring experience, right? If you have an experience on the other side. So you can imagine you're working on a computer to have a meeting, and then, well, you've been removed from this, get kicked out that account. And so there's elements of this that we also need to be conscious about, right? Because even though the technology is working amazing, you're securing the organization, you want to make sure that there's a human element tied to that, right? Because they can actually come back to help you. So I'm actually going to transition to Adriana and kind of explain a little, how do we do that in a great way that sets us up for success after they leave the organization?
Thanks, Chase. I don't know if most of you know, but do we know what Boomerang employees are? Those are employees that leave an organization, go somewhere, and then they come back, right? Offboarding is just as critical as the onboarding process, so something to really consider. Organizations, we want to retain skilled employees, right? It is very critical, especially now because of the Great Resignation, right? There's so many different opportunities available. Companies are going after, the same type of candidate pool as everybody else. So it's becoming very competitive. So what does this mean? What we want to do is assure that the employee has a good experience when they leave an organization. We want to be able to leave the door open. In your offboarding process, it leaves a very lasting impression to the employee. And depending on the experience that they have, they can choose to return, right? Or they can provide a good review for the organization. Or they could even refer somebody, right? That, hey, yes, I took this other opportunity, but I loved working on this company. They have great culture. They're fantastic, and they would encourage their friends to go work there. Those are the type of positive, lasting impressions that we want to have. And again, why it's so critical during the offboarding process to make sure that, once again, the employee is having the best experience. Chase, do you have any specific examples that perhaps you can share that you've experienced?
Oh yeah. So actually here within JumpCloud, we've had a few folks that have left and kind of rejoined the organization, which is super fun, right? Especially if you kind of see like, hey, here's the new class this week, right? And see some familiar names. But I think it is really important to kind of have that reputation as you go along, because there are many, many nice recruiters out there, right? And so the grass is always seem like good, but there's always those elements too of kind of established culture. There's kind of this known quantity, if you will. So it's really great to kind of have that come back into it. And so, and when you think about that, it's awesome, because then you have someone who's very familiar with the technology, the organization, kind of all these other pieces. So they actually hit the ground running faster than it would have been an external candidate. So making sure that you're nice to people, right? Throughout, right? Even if they're no longer with the organization, and making sure that they're welcoming, because there's a good chance that more people will come back into the organization. Because the other element to think about too is organizations change. They go through different growths, right? You could be at a startup, and then you're a small, medium, and then a mid-size, and then you kind of growth. Each one of those segments are a different kind of company that you join and come back to. So it's really cool to see that come around.
I love that you made that point, because I think that hits home here at Bamboo HR, because again, we're pretty much a doubling in size. And so, yes, it's almost like a different organization, even though we have a very strong culture. And that's one of the most amazing parts of why I'm here at Bamboo HR. And that's one of the main reasons that people want to join our organization. But as you mentioned, that depending on that growth and the changes, right? It does change a little bit. And I think, again, it's just really important to make sure that the employees are aware, they understand the whys, they get the big picture. And yeah, be nice. I like that, Chase. Because even though that they leave, you always want to make sure that lasting impression is a positive one. And you're getting feedback on ways that you can improve, and leaving that door open. So again, it affects so many different aspects. So even if they don't come back, are they providing good reviews on Glassdoor? Are they referring their friends and family that, hey, yeah, I worked for that company, they were awesome, right? So very critical and important part of the process. So this leads us into the next section. What happens when they don't maybe have that positive experience? When we are not timely and efficient in our exit protocol, what can happen is a few different things. The employee is still active in the system, right? They're still getting paid. They're not at the organization anymore, but they're getting paid and nobody knows, which I'm sure none of us have ever experienced that, right? Employees have access to sensitive information. There could be security breach. And really what happens is that the employee does not have a positive offboarding experience. Part of that offboarding experience is conducting an exit interview, making sure that the employee has all the information they need when they're exiting an organization. Do they know when they're getting their last paycheck? Do they know when their benefits end? Another critical piece is, again, because we are all remote, are we getting the equipment back, right? So there's so many things that fall under that, not only the security piece of it, but again, making sure that there is that positive experience that they're having when they're leaving the organization. Have we taken the time to explain to them what's going to happen? So just like with the onboarding, we want to be very consistent through that employee life cycle and give them the resources and support that they need in this transition. Chase, do you have another story for us?
I do. I have so many stories, but on this one, I think it's interesting. So just coming back to access after being gone. So actually, real quick, previous employer, right, that I kind of came through, we were integration background organization. So we had testing and sandboxes and access to kind of all of these different areas. And as I left the organization, on good terms, all good things, right? But it was one of those things where like, I didn't get any access or kind of emails, or I'm curious if what that looks. Lo and behold, right, a couple months later, I still had access to all of our testing environments in terms of AWS. So fortunately, the process was secured and shut down, so like that's good. But it was still within that element. It's like, hey, I could spin up a couple CPUs, it's going to run up the bill, right? Because it's all tied to the credit card. So again, if I wanted to be a nefarious kind of bad actor, you could have taken that turn. I didn't, right? I let the organization know because I liked them and I wanted them to succeed, right? And make sure we get the stock come through, because if they left it open for me, there's probably a good chance that they left it open for other folks. And this is one of those things that it affects smaller organizations much more so than other things, right? Because there could be other employees or other fires that you're trying to figure out, especially kind of if you're in a startup mode and you're like, oh, yep, great, good guy, right? We'll kind of move on, right? Because we have other things in front of us. But making sure that you have a secure gate, right, as employees leave is just as crucial, and if not more important for smaller organizations, because it can have a much more adverse impact as people leave. So.
Yep, absolutely. I had an experience with an organization where they kept me active for a little while. I was still getting emails from employees reaching out, and I answered a few, but I'm like, hey, just so you know, I'm no longer here. Let me direct you. I let the organization know, but then it still took some time. And I was like, oh, again, you want to do the right thing, right? And you want to help and assist, but I'm no longer here. I shouldn't have all this access, right? Or, incidences where, again, employees haven't been terminated. They're no longer with the organization and they just keep going through payroll, right? And sometimes that's hard to get those funds back, if ever, right? Do you even try? Like, where is the accountability point? So I'm sure that all of us have some of those fun stories, right?
Yes, love to hear them in the chat.
Yes. So let's finish up here and talk about some of the takeaways from this session. How you handle the transition between employees, software, and your organization can really make or break your employer brand, with effects on productivity, recruiting, and with retention, like we talked about. Smooth transitions, they really need to be clear goals and making sure that you have the technical support. Are you in sync with your Are you in sync with your IT department? Typically, HR and IT really need to be in sync as you're bringing on employees or onboarding them or offboarding them, right? If you don't have that clear channel of communication, a lot of things can get broken and missed during that process. Another thing would be having a system in place to give new hires the tools they need to be successful and ensure smooth integration into the organization, as we discussed. Help employees focus on forming those strong connections on day one. Make sure that they have the resources that they need, but more importantly, where do they go for those resources, right? Because if they don't know what they don't know, or they don't know where to get them, that again doesn't give them that best experience. And cloud-based access management, it really helps protect companies from costly errors, like missed terminations, not employees being paid, right? And breaches of company proprietary information, which is probably the biggest one, right? We don't want to be giving access to individuals that are no longer there, and having access to data, information that's very secure, right? And I think even more importantly is not knowing that they have that access, right? So I think that is definitely a critical piece. So again, it's very important that you have those policies in place and that you're being very consistent when you're looking at the entire life cycle of an employee and how it can really affect not only that employee, but the organization as a whole.
Awesome. Just turning on my video back on. That was great. Thank you so much, Chase and Adriana. I definitely learned a lot about onboarding and offboarding. I don't work in HR personally, but I definitely got some amazing takeaways that I know I can use, in my day-to-day work life. So thank you so much. We do have some time for questions. So we have a few in the chat here. I'm just pulling some up. Okay, so we have one submitted by Miguel. He asked, how would you handle a productive employee, but not a good employee himself? All consultations were done, but mistakes or incidents are being repetitive. Would it be wise to shift to offboarding?
Not necessarily. Oh, sorry, Chase. Did you want to take this? Are you okay with
Why don't
that?
you go? I think it'll
Okay.
be a little bit different. Yeah.
I think the most important place to start is making sure that how does the employee know what the expectations are? And if so, how do they know that? A lot of times I have managers come to me and say, well, they're not performing, they're not doing their job. Okay, well, have you spoken to them? Yes, I have. Okay, well, where is it documented? Right? Documentation is key. A lot of times I'll tell my managers is when you're having these conversations, follow it up with an email. And so you can say, hey, per our conversation today, I just want to make sure we're aligned. I want to make sure we're on the same page. And list those things out, right? When you get into a routine of doing that, you're making sure that there's alignment, that the employee understands what those expectations are. Are they missing the mark? If they are, why is that? Do they have the resources they need? Do they have the support they need? Is it a training issue, right? And just having the conversation isn't enough. It's following up with some kind of a written form. And again, it doesn't have to be a performance improvement plan, right? It's just a way to communicate and make sure that you're on the same page. Now, if that behavior or that performance continues to decline, then you want to make sure that have you given the employee the tools necessary to be successful? If you have, great. Have you had the conversations? Great. Have they been documented? Yes, they've been documented. If it's still not working, then that's the appropriate time to look at potentially ending that relationship with the employee and the organization.
Thank you. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Chase?
I'd say real quickly, so if I'm reading right, productive versus good, right? And so to me, that kind of either screams two things. One, it's either quality or culture, and they're typically kind of intertwined, right? And so if there's not good quality, then I think, again, it's like, what are the objectives? What are the expectations? Right? Really kind of sit down and say, look, I believe in you, you got this, but you're not hitting this mark, right? You're doing all these things great, but it's falling short. And I need you to realize that that is actually the crux of a lot of these things, right? And how you're kind of viewed. And I think it's always helpful to kind of make sure that feel as empowered and powerful. So like maybe, elements of, I'm sure, radical candor, right, that we kind of call through, but making sure that you have a good conversation. Like, look, I believe in you, you got to do this. And if you can't, like setting really clear expectations, right? And then you can go along the line of, is it documented, making sure that, those conversations start to go on. But if you don't, again, there's a lot of great talented people that are coming on. So you always got to take staff in terms of how much time and effort can you really kind of up level that person and believe in that? Or is there, they've kind of reached their capacity in this current role, right? And then a better person might be better suited to take that team or kind of impact. Because then you also have to think about the impact that has people around that, right? Because if it's not necessarily making mistakes slide, but it also sets inherent quality for other people to kind of look at too. And so that's the other piece that you need to keep in mind.
Love that. Thank you both so much for answering. Another question we have from Maria. Would you advise to use a platform for onboarding where a new employee has all the info needed? Things like training, live regular session with fellow colleagues, managers, and HR, etc.
I think it's definitely really important to have some sort of a platform, specifically with the onboarding and offboarding process. There's a lot of documents and items that we need to have the employee complete in order to set them up in our system, make sure that, we have their I-9, their tax information, their direct deposit, are they acknowledging and signing our policies, right? So again, it's just very critical to have something in place. When you're using a platform like that, so like, let's say Bamboo HR, right? Then you're making sure that you're in compliance, you're being consistent, and everybody's getting that same experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, it's a yes and, right? You want to give folks a grand central station and say, look, everything lives here. If you need to go anywhere, go there. It helps drive repetition, right? And kind of as people are coming through, because there's a ton of new resources when you join an organization. Recorded videos, meetings you have to attend, kind of all of those different pieces. So the more that you can centralize, the better. And I think one of the pieces that I want to touch on is, just because we've been talking about access a lot and trust, that also doesn't always imply context, right? So you also need to have a guiding factor and say, like, great, here's 10 hours of videos, we'll check out later. You want to make sure that they understand where the repository of all that lives. And then also kind of, operationally, it makes life easier in terms of where onboarding and all those components are, but making sure that it's alongside the context. And again, kind of think about that access matrix of how they can enter in the organization in a very, seamless fashion.
Awesome. This next question kind of goes along with that as well, with onboarding new employees. But we have a question that says, working in a startup can hold its own challenges when it comes to onboarding. It's good, but it can always be better. With that, as an individual contributor, I'm helping onboard a new manager to my team. Any tips or tricks for an individual contributor to step into that area to offer help?
Oh yeah. I guess I can start on this one. All sorts of challenges, right? And I think I've been part of companies where it's like, bring your own laptop, just show up here on it, like, and go, right? Because there's elements of that. And that's kind of, some of the things that you sign up. The good news is you have an opportunity to set that standard, right? And so they're coming in kind of eyes wide open, and you can kind of help understand, kind of give a lay of the land in terms of, here's where things are at, here's existing processes. I got some ideas of my own, right, in terms of improvements and other pieces, but you kind of serve as that that mile marker, that land post, in terms of, you're also the first element of culture, right, that person's coming in. And that is really important in startup mode, right? Because then you kind of think about how they want to manage and kind of grow in other people and teams. So I'd say don't lose that opportunity and kind of what you have in front of it, but then also come prepared, right? Kind of have a playbook of, here's what we're going to be walking through. Make sure it's not an avalanche of stuff and just assume that because they're a person, they're a smarter person in the room, right? They're all humans coming into this the same way. And so making sure that if you can put a process out in front of it, it also kind of goes to show, and maybe it might become the playbook for how the rest of the organization at least starts to think about not only this role, but other roles that you can start to impact too. So.
Very well said, Chase. Just a couple of things to add. One, there's always opportunity for improvement, always, right? We can always do better. We can always do more, right? Things change. I think that this is an amazing opportunity for an individual to step up to the plate and, again, have a huge impact. What I would recommend in doing all the things that Chase said, there's two things that I would do. One, I would think about, what are some of the important things that either were missed or that happened when I was onboarded, right? So a lot of times you can already anticipate some of the questions employees will have. Probably, what are my benefits? When do they start? When do I get paid? What's my PTO? Is there a PTO, right? How do I set up my direct deposit, right? Think about what that process was for you, outline it. And that's a really great way to start, to make sure that you're addressing and anticipating some of the questions that somebody new would want to know. Does everybody start at 8, or do they all kind of trickle in? Do I have to be in office, or can I work remote, right? These are all very relevant questions that we get. And then the second thing is, I would take a look at past experiences, even talk to colleagues. What are some things from past employers and past experiences that worked really well? What are some things that didn't, right? Again, this will help to kind of build that framework for you. And I think it's an amazing start, and you really have a great opportunity to create something amazing.
Love that. Thank you both so much for the answer. Speaking of, you mentioned, your individual experience with onboarding and offboarding. So what would you guys say is the best onboarding or offboarding process each of you have experienced directly?
I'll go. I had the best onboarding experience at Bamboo HR. And yes, I know I work here now, but it was such a great experience. My specific situation is I had about 2 months before I actually took the role. And how engaged my director was with me. She made sure to touch base with me. She set up a couple calls. I was able to talk to the team that I would be working with. One of my favorite things is one day I just got a text message and it was a picture. And again, everybody's remote, right? It was like the Brady Bunch on Zoom, and each of them had like a letter, and it said like welcome, right? And it just made me feel so excited, and that they're taking the time to acknowledge, and they're anticipating for me to start is huge. And I think what happens a lot of the times is we start thinking on this really grand level and all these things we have to do, but it's really those little small things that have the biggest impact. Start small. You can always build, right? When you start over here, it gets so overwhelming. And then at that point, you don't even know where to begin, right? Again, thank you, being kind. That acknowledgement goes a long, long way.
Absolutely. I guess I'll take the other path, right, and kind of like think about offboarding, because it's usually less fun. But I think some of the better experiences I've had has also been a guiding hand on kind of how to leave, right? And so it's also a different experience. Like, where's the exit door? I've never asked before, but like I'm on, like, where do I go? And I think it's really helpful, kind of not only having hiring managers, but also leadership part of the team to kind of help treat it as an opportunity, right? And so people leave, and it could be an amazing opportunity. It could also be, I don't really like my manager, or it could be anything else in between when people decide to leave an organization. And so one of the companies that I left when I was leaving, it was very, very gracious, right? In terms of like, okay, here's the process, right? That stays here, that's ours, right? Grab everything else that you'd like. But part of that flow is actually, I got to sit down with the CEO and say, hey, just let me know why, right? And kind of left it very open-ended, and kind of, we had a great conversation in terms of, where the company's heading and kind of all of those other pieces. But it's also that level of understanding, because he's like, here's the best chance that you have right before they leave the door, kind of truly get a thought of what's going on between the organization. And for him, it was also very valuable, because that serves as kind of a litmus test, right, for other people, right? And so it's like, well, he's leaving. He was like, are there other folks? Kind of, is there something larger that I need to address here? Or is it just the case that, you won the lottery, you got a better opportunity to move on, right? And so kind of taking those moments and treating them all as opportunities.
Thank you. Love that. I love that you both shared an experience with onboarding and offboarding, which is great. And speaking of offboarding, I think we have time for one more question here. So, what have been your biggest challenges as it relates to offboarding employees?
I think for us, it's about creating a new process that is smooth, and again provides that good employee experience with us all being remote. That was a really big shift change, right? And I think it was for a lot of organizations. There were a lot of new challenges that came up that we didn't have to worry about before, right? And so I think that, again, how do we make sure that employees are feeling welcomed, right? Because we're no longer in person. How are we conducting their offboarding? How are we getting our equipment back, right? So making sure that there's a process in place, and you're looking again that we want to provide them with that good experience, just as if we were in person. But how do we do that now remotely?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the element of being nice, right? You need to put in the extra effort since you're not there with the person. And so that kind of has a double-edged sword, right? Because then you say, hey, I'm not in the room, right? It's easier. But it's also not fair to the employee. So I guess I'll come at it from the angle of when someone leaves and it's not their choice, right? And kind of the organization has made a decision, or kind of you as a hiring manager has made a decision that the team needs to go in a different direction. In that type of scenario, the offboarding process is a lot longer, but it should be, right? It should be a lot of conversations to understand. So when you finally get to that point, it's really a date scheduling, right? A logistical conversation, right? Because all the hard conversations have been had before. It shouldn't come as a surprise. And I think that is really helpful because, well, one, you're more likely to get your stuff back, but then two, there's been a constant understanding throughout that, right? And so they can at least leave the organization, say, I did my best, or it wasn't quite in the right direction, or something else where, again, it's not as much of a sour taste as it could be, right? I think we've also seen where it's gone horribly wrong, and it really, and that is the last thing that people remember, right? And it's a small community, especially, right, if you're working within it's a existing talent pools, right? And so for me, I'm here in Denver, right? And so I've been in the software space for a long time here in Denver, and you see a lot of the same faces, right, as you go through companies. And new companies are started and folded and kind of all over time, but there's a consistent group of folks. And so making sure that they all feel empowered, right, regardless of where they are in terms of the company's life cycle, as well as their life cycle as an employee within that, it all kind of works together, and you're not, you're doing the best you can given the circumstances.
Yep. And I think that the most important thing that you mentioned, Chase, is that it should never be a surprise, right? Because if you're doing things and having those conversations and being transparent and setting those expectations, when you get to this point, that there shouldn't be any surprises there.
Love that. I definitely have had a personal experience where I was let go on the spot, and it was a surprise, and it was not a good experience. I mean, I was emotional. This is hard to admit, no one wants to admit this, but I was emotional. I was surprised, and I was upset because no one told me, no one gave me a chance, I felt like, to correct what I was doing wrong. And I was not able to be given the chance to be heard. And so I agree with what both of you guys are saying. It shouldn't come to us a surprise, and, having those conversations beforehand, having a process in place so that it's not a surprise, I think is the best way to offboard. So thank you so much for that information. I know I really appreciate it. But again, thank you so much for speaking in general. This has been a great webinar, a lot of amazing takeaways. And, if you enjoyed what you heard today, check out Bamboo's content library for more webinars, and also head over to JumpCloud for more amazing resources and content as well. And then as a reminder, we will be sending out the slide deck and a recording of the webinar within 3 business days. So look for that. And then you'll automatically get sent out the SHRM the SHRM credit qualification to anyone who attended at least 50 minutes today. And again, we want to give a big shout out to our speakers and JumpCloud for teaming up with us today on today's webinar and sharing their insights and personal experiences. If you have any questions, feel free to connect with them on LinkedIn. They would love to chat and connect with you. And then don't forget to follow Bamboo HR and JumpCloud on social media as well. We both deliver regularly great content that can help elevate your teams and organizations. So we would love to see you at our next webinar, and thank you and have a good day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yep.
Please subscribe and check out more content from us.